So thank you for dialing into this Juro webinar, which is all about legal operations from nothing to something. These slides will be available after the webinar, and this is being live recorded so you can access it afterwards. I'm really pleased to be joined today by, firstly, Holly Manville. So Holly is Deputy Company Secretary and Head of Legal Operations at Trainline. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you.
Also with me in London is Natalie Solanki, who is VP Head of Legal Europe at FleetCor, and also contributed to our recent ebook on legal operations. Welcome, Natalie.
Thanks.
And joining us from Stockholm is Amy Jacobi, who is Legal Operations Manager at Spotify. So welcome to Amy as well.
Thank you.
So during this webinar, we're going to be talking all about legal operations, and it's going to be a Q&A discussion with the panel. But just firstly to kind of introduce for those on the line who don't know what legal ops is. So we tend to define legal operations in the definition given by CLOC, which is the Corporate Legal Operations Consortium. And they define legal ops as a multidisciplinary function that optimizes legal services delivery to a business, government, or business entity by focusing on 12 core competencies. So as we talk about the business of law, it's sometimes helpful to use this wheel, which we have on the slides just on the right-hand side. And on those slides, we have 12 competencies, and we're going to pull out not all of them, but I think six or seven of them on this call, and we're going to get the discussion going in that way. So we're going to dive straight in, and we're going to start with communication. So I think as kind of in-house lawyers or former in-house lawyers, we're all used to seeing an inbox piling up with emails coming in. Kind of first question, I think, to Holly, I mean, when you're seeing that level of email comms coming in, like what can you actually do practically to make that better?
It's a very good question. I think, as you said, it's endemic for all of us, regardless of what we work in. I think certainly with our team at Trainline, it's been identifying what exactly are people contacting you about, and then being able to make steps to actively provide the information for them in a different place. For example, we use our sort of internal SharePoint to make sure that all of the questions that the business could possibly have that aren't too technical or otherwise the answers can be easily found in a central stored resource. And also just making sure that we're linking different pieces of technology. So we use Slack, for example, at Trainline. So we ensure that any questions that the business may have on Slack link back to relevant pages elsewhere. So it's really understanding what people are contacting you for, pulling out the key FAQs, and that actually saves a lot of time, because I think a lot of email churn is often about really simple questions where people just can't find or can't be bothered to find the answer. So for us, cutting out that sort of initial way in for them has been really helpful, and also for them, because it makes it a lot easier for them to find what they need faster.
And how do you find that divide between Slack and email? So obviously Slack is getting quite prevalent in sort of modern tech organizations, but how do you find the divide there? I mean, do you feel like Slack is solving that problem, or do you think it can add to the burden?
It's a good question. I think they're inherently two different things for two different purposes. Email is obviously the opportunity to share in a little bit more depth, include other people, so using obviously CCs, etc. And Slack for us has been very useful in just answering quick fire questions. It can become stressful if it's overused, obviously, and flipping between two different methods. But I think it's just being clear, using the right methodology for what it is you're actually trying to achieve. Email serves a purpose, but it's not always best or the only source of communication.
And Natalie, you come from FleetCor, but have had a series of roles in other organisations. For you, I mean, has Slack made it yet to FleetCor?
Despite being a leading and innovative technology company, unfortunately, it hasn't. I think one of our challenges is, and I think these are great sort of things to have, but you've got your company culture you've got to work with. I think it's great if you're in a very sort of agile tech kind of startup environment, you're more open-minded to these type of things. Whereas I think, especially American companies that are more established aren't always open to this sort of new technology, especially when you've got a certain pipe or roadmap you've got to get it through. So I think for us, email is always going to be a bit of a way of life. If we look at the way that sort of my teams are, they're sort of set all across the globe. You're not always going to get the real-time communication ability or need, because obviously we're all working across different time zones, so perhaps you do have a bit more time to play with. So I guess all the ways that I look at sort of if emails are an inevitability, how can you kind of deal with reducing the burden? I guess, if you can do the face-to-face time, I still think, that human element to jobs, and if you do have an office, and you do get your people together in offices or environments, leveraging that and making the most out of it's really important. We still have telephones. I know we prefer to text these days, but, I think sometimes you can read into text things that aren't necessarily there. And I think sometimes hearing somebody's voice, meeting them in person really helps break down those social barriers. I mean, looking at the email piece, I kind of look at it as, I've got my email inbox. I think email zero is something I find quite important. And so for me, a clear mind, a clear desk, a clear email inbox kind of helps. So, moving things from an email environment to a calendar or a task list, I think is a really good way just to reduce that sort of issue. I think also being quite good at when you actually read your emails, I think we will talk about this a lot, but actually being a bit more disciplined. I tend to factor out time in my calendar for whether it's appointments or time to do work, which includes the window for reading emails. But the great thing about, putting that time in your calendar is you normally get that kind of 5-minute window at the end. That's a great time to kind of feel like, hey, pat on the back, got through that. But also let's reduce some of that kind of email Tetris, I like to kind of call it. It's quite a fun game that you can kind of play with yourself if, checking emails is fun.
And I know, we hear, I think, the narrative of legal teams going from being a sort of reactive function to a proactive function. I think it's often very hard if you've got emails continually coming in and you're looking at them in real time to be proactive. A question to Amy. Spotify obviously based between multiple countries, but US and Sweden. How do you enable your legal team to communicate well?
Well, I think it is adapting to the customer since we are a service organization. So a lot of our R&D teams do use Slack. So our attorneys who support them will be jumping in on Slack on a regular basis. But I think what we have found and what I have just experienced in general is taking advantage of your collaboration software that you might have in the company, whether that's a OneNote or a Google Doc or Google Drive, just generally. It allows you to provide, updates. It allows you to collaborate together on documents, and that can really reduce the email churn of going back and forth with people that you're interacting with. It lets you easily share a document once it becomes relevant to your business stakeholder, and it also helps from a time difference perspective because the US is either 6 to 9 hours away from Stockholm, so that can be a challenge as well. So the collaboration, you can do it both from a business stakeholder perspective and who your clients are, as well as within your internal legal team and what, any updates for the team, any best practices. If you have feedback on law firms, there's all good ways to be able to share information quickly when it pops into your mind without sending email and then having to file it or read it or respond to it.
And I think it's a really nice segue to the next question. So I think in businesses that there is already software, and sometimes we see just issues with people adopting what they have. Is that something you see as a kind of adoption challenge, Amy, for kind of getting the legal team on board with really leveraging what's there already?
Yes, technology generally, especially new technology, can be difficult, and there can be a tendency to try to throw new tools at legal teams on a regular basis and see what sticks. And that can create a lot of fatigue. So it's, from my experience, it's championing the technology, but pairing it with the need and making it real for the attorneys, so that they see it as a good thing, and they more take it as their responsibility to work through it and help us make it better because they see the long-term vision there.
Thanks. And Holly, sort of from a Trainline and kind of elsewhere perspective, what hacks do you think there are to actually use what we have already without adding additional tools to the stack?
Yeah, it's probably the best and the easiest place to start, particularly when it comes to budgets, or as Amy hinted at, introducing new tools to teams takes time. It takes a lot of investment, it takes relationships, and it takes money. So the key thing is not just perhaps technology that the legal team itself has, but actually what the business has, because ultimately the legal team services the business. So it's important that everyone's sort of aligned on it. I think for us, fortunately, being a tech company, we have access to different tech systems which are used perhaps by our development teams, such as Jira, which has been fundamental in us changing the way that we as a team work with the business, allowing the business to raise tickets. Again, towards the communication point, reducing emails, the business raises tickets for our team, allocating us or assigning us work or asking questions, which we then deal with. So that's something that was already in Trainline, which we've sort of adopted within our team. Slack too, just something that everybody uses, but again, tweaking it and developing it and making it something that adds value to the legal team and also ultimately then to the business as well. So I think playing with the resources that you do have is always a good place to start, and it's a great way of being able to thrash out your actual pain points. Amy hinted at it. Legal ops has to be a way of thinking about systems and processes. Legal ops isn't about buying technology. The buying the technology comes secondary. I think that's really important, particularly if you're either new to legal ops or you're a small startup and you haven't got the budget, resources or otherwise to scale something really hard and really fast. It's easy to start small in that respect.
And it's, I mean, most businesses will have the basics of, Microsoft Excel, for example. It seems to be an under-leveraged kind of tool in legal service. And Natalie, what kind of hacks do you have from what's there already in the business that can be done much better?
I guess I've done a number of these kind of setting up a legal function role as the first. And I think, generally we all have Outlook or a version thereof. I think Google has a little bit more functionality, which sort of makes it a bit cleverer. You've got Windows, which is where all your files are, and you've got Excel, as we were just touching upon. So there's probably a way you can set up your own, relatively efficient but relatively simple document management system, whereby if you've got Outlook folders with a reference number in Outlook, which are on a shared server, then as long as you're all on the same IT infrastructure, you'll have access to it. Great. It's not clogging up your inbox and the amount of megabytes you're allowed in there or not allowed in there. Brilliant. With Windows, you give that same reference point. Awesome. If it's on a shared file, same systems, you have access to it. With the Excel spreadsheet then, as long as you're getting the right tags and different kind of ways of categorizing whatever it is that you're working on. So matter spreadsheets, if it's a contracts database, making sure it's got the right reference, your WIP list. I think that's quite an interesting one. And, you've got those references quite easily and quite, effectively, you can use relatively what are quite basic tools, but actually everybody's familiar with, without spending a penny. I think, a lot of people, as Holly was saying, you don't really leverage what you've got. That's something that in every role I've had, literally in the first few days, I set up.
Yeah, and I think, in our ebook, I think Dean Nash from Monzo made a similar point, which is with a Google Sheet, you can do a lot for a kind of contract management or contract tracking process. When you max out on that, like maybe you need to do something else, but there's actually a lot that can be leveraged without actually having to do any buying of software.
I think that's the key point we were talking about actually earlier, is that actually you have to start really simple and actually just be able to map out the process manually before you know exactly what it is that you're looking to buy. So these really simple office-based tools are super in that respect.
Great. So just want to kind of move on to the next section. So moving a little bit away from technology, which I think is important in the context of legal ops. So organizational design is one of the core competencies in this clock wheel. And I think we've got on the line a range of people from different sizes of organizations, but kind of how you hire the team is obviously something that's driven in part by the GC, but also by the legal ops function. So the question we thought was interesting as well, not being in a legal team of 400 people, if you're in a legal team of one person, actually kind of who is that next crucial hire you bring into the business, and how does that pan out kind of going forward? Maybe a question first to Holly.
I think hiring the second person depends on the first person that you have. I think it's all about balance. You don't necessarily want to duplicate a resource, especially if they're limited. But I think especially the smaller that you are, it's got to be someone who in some ways is as general as possible. But again, it depends on the first person that you've got in your team. So it's balance between someone who's a generalist and also having the analytical and in-depth detailed skills that you need to be an effective counsel and certainly an effective in-house legal team. I think the theme of balance is super important, especially understanding what skills your team have and also what you're trying to achieve. There's for us being in-house, you obviously have to work with the business, so which requires in some ways a different language and a different way of thinking to be able to marry legal support into the general Trainline environment for us. So it's an incredibly subjective process.
And how, I mean, when was legal ops brought in terms of headcount number in the legal team?
Our legal ops function was developed about 9 months ago, so we're relatively new, and it's built out of existing resources. So in terms of understanding what it's like to work with perhaps limited people, it is very much who is the best fit, or what are the sort of key skills that you need in order to achieve a certain aim. I think that's got to be the imperative when you're looking to scale something up from nothing.
And Natalie, just from the perspective of maybe this is a distant memory in Fleet Core terms, but what do you look for in that second key hire?
I think, as Holly was saying, you're looking more at skill set and complementary skill sets, but also I think a propensity to roll off your sleeves, because even if it's an established business, if you are hiring the second lawyer, it usually means that legal hasn't been a priority before. So I think lawyers who are used to that structured environment, their own narrow discipline and their way of operating, not in chaos, isn't always the right fit for a lot of people out there. I guess what I found is usually, being a senior lawyer myself, if I'm the first lawyer, the second lawyer, I've generally found having somebody quite junior is quite a good fit for that, because they don't have that snobbery towards things that be a bit more administrative, operational, more willing to kind of roll up their sleeves. So I guess then you're looking at the qualities that person would have. So that propensity to learn, that independence, that self-starter mentality. I think curiosity is a really good one as well. So I find, I've got a really awesome paralegal who's supporting me at the moment, and the stuff she does, I'm sure, is the equivalent of some, trainee lawyers, just because she's getting that opportunity and is learning and then building on that knowledge, and is also being given the trust. And so when you trust that person, give them that exposure to the different business people, you're actually leveraging more out of those people.
It's possibly a better learning experience than being a trainee solicitor. But Amy, from the perspective of kind of Spotify, and I know the other organisations you've worked at, again, maybe this is a kind of distant memory, but how would you put together that initial team, were you to be in a kind of small, fast-growing kind of tech startup, as it were?
Yeah, so generally, you don't have a legal operations team at that point. And so what I would recommend, just from my experiences, is making sure that second lawyer has some project management skills and has some comfort or familiarity with budgets, because that's always going to play a factor in the legal department. And the more skills you have there in terms of project management or being able to scope out matters, negotiate with your firms, know how much something should cost, that's going to lay out a really good foundation for when the legal team continues to grow, that these types of expectations and this type of rhythm is there. And you don't want to wait until you are big enough to have a legal operations team to come in and start to require those disciplines, I guess, because that makes it a lot harder to unwind things than it is to build from the ground up.
And does it feel, thinking about a business at that stage, I mean, legal ops is kind of happening anyway, right? Whether there's the function or not. Is it sort of, have you seen kind of cases where, people who haven't had that dedicated legal ops title or kind of functional kind of focus have just had to learn it and had to kind of get on with it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a great point. Legal ops has to happen regardless. The priority in which it happens and the diligence in which it happens, it's probably not to where it should be, because the lawyers don't necessarily have the time or the skills or the interest, depending on what their backgrounds are. So again, the more breadth that the attorneys in the early stages can have, or at least trying to put those boundaries in place in terms of creating a scope and feeling comfortable with numbers and spend and invoices, I think will serve the department in the long term.
Because I know, Amy, you came from a finance background, so I guess to kind of Holly and Natalie, thinking about that mix of skill sets in legal teams, so going a little bit beyond the kind of second lawyer in the company, do you think there's this a kind of danger of, we see increased specialization in legal teams as you kind of scale up, looking for increasingly niche areas of focus. Do you think there's ever a danger that we move away from the fundamental skill sets, whether it's someone who is data driven or someone who is kind of process minded versus just trying to get that legal experience that we need?
Yeah, I think I agree there. And I think really that's why it's so bespoke to the individuals you already have and the type of business you operate in. And I think, you look at law firms which are full of lawyers, not a lot of those have the same skill set. So are you really doing your own teams or functions justice if you're imposing this expectation of, in private practice it would have been you're only validated if you become a partner. Or do we really want to turn that on the in-house perspective on being you're only validated if you can do all these hundreds of things, which is sell the department, be amazing at legal ops, be great at templates, great at knowledge management. Some people have those skills, and I guess I'd like to think I can do those, but a lot of lawyers aren't looking for that and don't want that. So I'd hate to pigeonhole people by trying to make them a master of everything and not one thing.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Just on that point, I think you don't need a whole team of generalists. You need 100%. You need people who are specialists in certain areas, depending on the nature of the business or certain projects that you're working on. And just your point, people have natural skills. So it is about having an inherent understanding of the people within your team, what they're great at, what they actually want, or what they're looking to achieve ultimately themselves. I mean, this is part of sort of retention too within, whether it's legal ops or core legal anyway, is asking them. I think there is a danger, obviously, that legal ops almost becomes too big and that everyone needs to be involved in it, rather than it just being a way of thinking that a few people perhaps are better at than others and playing to people's strengths.
And it sounds like a very human problem, which is I think a really interesting part of thinking about kind of organizational design. Just to pause for a moment, there is a kind of live Q&A system in place in the webinar. So if you have any thoughts or questions on this or any other aspect, please do pop your questions in there. We're going to have at least 10 minutes at the end to go through that, and we'd love to hear from the audience. I think we'll move on to the next segment. So this is cross-functional alignment. Again, quite a human issue as well. So thinking about kind of different areas of the business, your internal client finance teams, there are obviously multiple stakeholders going on, not least the people on the other side of these legal transactions and contracts. To Holly, I mean, who's the one ally elsewhere in the business you should focus on aligning with, and you can only choose one?
Okay, pin me down. For us, it's been, given the sort of stage where we've been at Trainline, the size of our sort of legal ops and legal team in general, it has been the CFO. I think having the finance alignment has been useful, not only from a budgeting perspective, but also because somebody at that level can be a great mentor, but also has expertise and understanding of what the exec want and what the exec are looking for, and can better marry, or at least help you understand what you're trying to achieve, how that fits with the wider strategic goals of, essentially for us, for Trainline. Having that sort of person backing at that level is really important.
And to Natalie, I mean, who would you choose if you had to choose one ally in the business?
Well, I'd choose the finance director, but I mean, from a slightly more manipulative perspective, one of the sort of allies I've sort of focused on is where most of our volume of work comes from, and who is that main stakeholder. And trying to, especially if you're trying to set up a function or you're new, I think really getting that person on board, understanding their concerns, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and focusing on them. Generally, once you get them on board and you're aligned, you've then got a really good ally to kind of fly the flag for legal, which then usually permeates through and people start to get wind that actually perhaps, legal are not a blocker, they're actually helpful, and, you tend to get much more leads as a result. So I've kind of tried that a few times. It's been quite successful. And
how do you ensure that the legal function is given that weight? So just from the perspective of understanding who the key stakeholders are, all the way through to actually kind of what do you do to ensure legal is not only being an enabler, but also is known to be an enabler in the business?
I think lawyers aren't very good at this. We're not very good at kind of blowing our own trumpets in a good way, other than thinking that we're more intelligent than others. It's but actually sharing success stories, but also sharing pain points. I think it comes down to being quite transparent and open and having that kind of dialogue. We touched on communication earlier. I think kind of asking for feedback and not being afraid of it. generally starts that sort of, conversation, and then you're more able to adapt to the way in which the different stakeholders want to be treated. Not one business is the same, not one stakeholder is the same. And I guess, unfortunately, as a service provider, it's kind of down to you to take that initiative to marry what your service is to what that they want. Then, clients aren't always good at articulating what it is what they want. And I think part of our operational function is trying to understand how we get the right information to be able to do the job that we want to do and that they want us to do.
And Amy, I know that the Spotify legal team is now pretty large, I think in the hundreds of lawyers, or at least close to that. From your perspective, how do you ensure that those kind of services are being delivered to the internal client in the right way, and who do you ally with in that process?
Well, I think the lawyers at Spotify have a lot of autonomy, and so they are able to work with the key stakeholders as they see fit. And so it's more of a requirement that they are partnering and are stepping in and are part of that process. So there's less of a structure, I guess. And if I could go back to the question, I would completely agree with Holly and Natalie, and those top two allies, the CFO and your biggest stakeholder internally. I would potentially, if I had to pick a third, I would say that finding someone outside of the legal team who can help you solve the problems or the challenges within the legal team in terms of what's taking so long. How can we do something faster? Why aren't we communicating better with our clients? Or how did we miss this with our clients? A lot of the legal industry is rooted in tradition, and so sometimes things get done the same way over and over. And so having someone with an outside perspective gives some thoughts to how to break that cycle and how to potentially do something differently can create some opportunities to experiment and try some new things.
And I think it's a really interesting point, because this question kind of assumes there's a problem to be solved. But I guess what's kind of interesting, maybe to Holly and Natalie, how do you actually go about assessing what the priority problems are? I mean, there's always problems, there's always lots of them, but how do you actually focus your teams on solving what's important?
That's a very good question. We have sort of a couple of mechanisms. I mean, I think it's communicating. Especially when you're developing something like a legal ops program, or let's just call it sort of developing efficiencies within your team to make things work better. It's just identifying those pain points, no matter how small they are. And it can be, as we often do, you just get in a room with a pile of post-it notes and you just write them all on the wall. What are the things that really frustrate you, whether it's about the business, whether it's about systems that you're using, whether it's about teams or otherwise, and you can start to group those and see what are the biggest hard-hitting areas that affect most of your team. Always a good place to start. And I think we also, having something like Jira, or at least just monitoring the queries and questions that are coming in from the business, again, you can start to understand what are the key themes. I think prioritizing volume is obviously the most, or I should say, is the most obvious place to start in some respects when trying to nail those pressures.
And it's interesting you mentioned Jira. I mean, Jira is often used as part of agile working by software teams. Mm-hmm. It's funny, we hear this term agile quite a lot in the context of legal, but actually agile is quite a formal process, isn't it? Is that something you've been through with the legal team in terms of actually running things like design sprints and kind of agile work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps sort of working, started in a digital startup myself, so I was working very much in agile processes, and actually being able to have an opportunity to marry that within the legal function has been very exciting. It's definitely not always been easy, but it is the premise that it's less about calling it agile, it's just sort of the way of thinking that you communicate frequently, so you're overcoming obstacles frequently. You're not waiting a week, you're not waiting 2 weeks, a month for feedback. In order to improve your quality and efficiency, and often also morale. People don't like sitting on things for a while. We like to resolve problems that we can actually get on with what we're doing. So it's been about how do you foster that just understanding and key communication between people on a regular basis, which has worked quite well. And
Natalie, does this sound like Lloyd's to you, or do you think we're too afraid of failure to go through these processes?
That's a difficult question. I think it's all possible. I guess it depends on the culture of your company again and what you're trying to achieve. So as much as I'd love to go to a Jira-based type environment and post-it notes and brainstorms, I guess in my company it's slightly different in that, you know, I've got 5 presidents I support who are based globally, all of whom have competing priorities and aren't always effective communicators to one another. They'd admit that themselves, so hopefully they won't be too offended. So I think one of the challenges for me and my team has been, how do we make sure that they have visibility of what we're working on and are able to help with the prioritisation? Because I think a lot of the pressure's put on lawyers to decide on the prioritisation, and, you know, we're smart individuals, we think we can kind of fudge it and work it out. But sometimes you're not going to get a better response other than from the person themselves. The problem I have is that I've got 5 people with the same sort of stature who need to kind of be brought into it. So I guess what I've done for my teams is that we do time record, I'm afraid to say. We do log the different type of requests we have and categorise them accordingly. And we are sort of tracking when things come in, whether it's with us, you know, how long that's sort of taking between communication, so that we can start to highlight to the business where the touch points are. And also it allows us to say, well, look, actually, this amount of our time is actually being spent equally across you as our business partners. You know, there's no fight about it. You know, let us know if that's okay. And we can flag the priority items as well. So that transparency really helps me manage, you know, a cross-section of very important people who have a lot of time, but they've got that there now. And interestingly, since we've implemented that, now that they're comfortable that they know what we're doing, that kind of prioritisation is naturally happening without too much involvement, which I think is quite an interesting point. Sometimes setting up these things in an operational fashion, you can then look at them 6 to 12 months later and realise that that's had the desired effect, and perhaps your operational design could now sort of graduate into something different.
And do you think just sort of away from the process and the kind of sophisticated operational side of it, do you think as legal teams we spend enough time just talking to our internal clients about how they're feeling about the services we deliver?
I think they're a bit scared sometimes. I think we're scared to get the bad feedback, and I think sometimes being more comfortable with asking questions and dealing with negative feedback in a way that isn't the end of the world, is actually constructive, it will hopefully make it more normal. So I think I encourage my teams to ask those open questions, to get feedback, to make it both ways. And the more comfortable we are getting those micro bits of feedback, and I think, you know, there's a comment about millennials being more susceptible to this micro feedback environment. Well, that means we can kind of change with the times as well. Now, hopefully that's kind of making the real-time results more sort of applicable, and therefore it's easier for you to adapt to what your client wants and even what your staff internally want.
And Holly, I mean, is this, if it is the case that we don't talk to our internal clients enough, do you think that's a problem of, you know, a fear of negative feedback, or do you think it's just a prioritization problem? It's just there's so much busyness going on in legal teams that actually it's really hard to actually carve out that time to go and do that work on understanding that cross-functional relationship.
I think it's in part the latter. I think it's once you get the feedback, you need to do something about it, depending on obviously the gravity of it, which too takes time. It takes further investigation, further conversation. So I think that sort of time is an important one in gaining the feedback and planning out how you sort of best resolve those issues. But I think it's also the profile of the legal team within the business. And you often see, because legal is perhaps more of a support function traditionally than a hard-hitting sales, generating revenue, kind of smashing team, that it takes a lot more effort to put legal out there in quite a positive way, because people often see it as something that may hinder or slow down the business, how long it takes to get a contract completed, for example. Obviously, it's a function that also spends money rather than directly generates it. So it's, in some ways, it's perception, I think. It's changing people's perception about how legal works in the business and for the business, which in turn, I think, allows people to become more comfortable with what we're doing and how we're doing it, and in turn allows them to drive feedback that way. And I think that transparency, right, and then understanding what the legal team is for, allows them to sort of feedback more openly.
And on the subject of being a function that spends money, vendor management is the next topic. So I think this is, I know, Amy, this is something that you actually have sort of direct responsibility for and a lot of experience in. So the question is, what's the single most valuable behavioural change that you should ask from your external counsel?
So yes, I do have quite a bit of experience, and I could talk for the whole hour or more on this question alone. And I might break the rules here and not give just one. I'm going to give three. The first one is just generally work with the firms and the people you want to work with, and that part of that is making sure that the law firms are being friendly to your company. I see a lot of terms and conditions that come through my office from law firms, and law firms ethically are supposed to be they're representing you and doing the best for you. But the terms and conditions I have seen more and more over the past couple of years are becoming less and less friendly to the client. And the prime example is the conflict waiver. Check your terms and conditions with your law firms, because most likely, at least with the bigger law firms these days, they will require a blanket conflict waiver for all future potential conflicts, meaning you wouldn't even be notified if your law firm is now representing your direct competitor. I personally don't think that's ethical. I hate that clause, and that's a no-go for us. So we push back on that one. But it's really easy to gloss over terms and conditions. Sometimes they're 16 pages long. So how do you actually grab that or look at that? So just pay attention to your T's and C's. The next one I would say is a behavioral change for the law firm, and that would be pushing them to move away from the hourly billing. Hourly billing is just a terrible model. It doesn't actually provide value to the client. And so start talking about the work in more of, what does it mean to you as the client? How valuable is it to the company? You need this particular research to be done. You need this negotiation to be done. What are you willing to pay for it? And how they get it done is up to them. So that I would encourage that. And the last point would be for your most strategic law firms, the ones that are really helping you in the most important areas of your company. Try to build a bigger relationship with them. Right now, law firms are generally transactional relationships with their clients. You engage them, they get the work done, they invoice you, and then they just wait for the next matter to come in. The ones that are more strategic, start asking for more value. Start bringing them in and creating more value in a longer term relationship than just a transactional relationship. I think they have a lot of resources, and we can demand more from them. We would have to give more as well, but it becomes a much more enjoyable and interesting relationship when we can start thinking of them as our strategic partners rather than just our law firms.
And I think, Amy, this is a hugely important topic. I think often because the external spend of a law firm may be the biggest budget component of it, among other things. Just to pick up on one point there, so you mentioned hourly billing. Are you seeing traction there in terms of ensuring that your law firms are pricing based on value as opposed to hourly billing, or do you still see a kind of legacy of that being pushed?
I think in the US especially, the alternative fee arrangement momentum is increasing quite significantly. The client has to demand it. So the law firms won't just come to the door and say, we're willing to do it for this amount. So the client has to push, and the law firms will generally push back because it makes the law firm take on more risk. But if you just ask the firm to do this particular work and just charge me however many hours it takes, there's no risk on the law firm. So it's time we start to change that risk balance. And again, in the US, it's really gaining traction. In Europe, I have found that it's more novel, but it's still possible. So it's just a matter of knowing your law firms and what the work you're asking them to do will be.
And on the question of the kind of strategic relationship, so let's say the law firm pitching to you prices based on value, they're chosen, they're on your panel. Do you have any examples of how you can kind of continue to have that proactive strategic relationship? Are there any kind of specific engagement types you would recommend?
There are a couple. It goes to as basic a level as creating a retainer arrangement where they are there for any strategic questions that you have between matters. to the more strategic types of arrangements where on a quarterly basis or semi-annual or even annual, there's a strategic workshop. There's a panel where the firm comes in and works with the lawyers and you start to brainstorm. Or, if you're a product company, they come in and there's a product strategy session that you're working with the top people across the product groups and legal, and you're brainstorming and you're talking about the future and what do we need to accomplish to make that happen. It's going beyond the transaction, and it's figuring out how can we utilize this brain that knows industry-wide what's happening, where we are very focused on our own company. But the benefit of using the law firms is that they're supposed to be learning a lot more worldwide or industry-wide. And so it's trying to harness that information to the betterment of your own company. And I've seen that work quite well.
And Holly, how can external counsel do a better job, I guess, is what this comes down to.
Yeah, well, I think the sort of key thing that I had in mind was sort of summarising in some ways what Amy's spoken about is flexibility. I think that's the most important thing, certainly for us, moving forward in our relationships with counsel. Retainers being one, yes, it's a great opportunity to be able to flex with them in terms of your workload and also the type of work. I think that's the key thing, especially for in-house, is that there are various different projects, various different types of expertise that you'll need at any one time. So being able to chop and choose what it is that you're working on in those retainers is really helpful. But I think because we're trying to implement new sort of tech systems, whether it's billing or otherwise, it's important for us that our external counsel are on board with that and they understand the role that we would like them to play in those new systems and processes. And we sort of have actively chosen not to work with a few of our firms going forward on the basis of their inflexibility around what we as a team and ultimately Trainline as a company is trying to achieve in being more efficient, more agile, more tech focused.
Leslie, how do you think firms can become more flexible in that regard?
I think just being more open about their constraints and the business model that they operate in. I think, as Amy was touching upon, the law firm models predicated on billable hours, and that drives the behaviours of individuals all the way up to partner level. To some extent, where partners are doing work they really shouldn't to hit their own targets. So I think that's a real big change that needs to happen in the profession, and it is. And I think a lot of work is done for fixed fee, but funnily enough, if they go over the fixed fee, they will still quote you the amount of billable hours they've gone over. So, come on. I think, if we were looking at the behavioural change I'd like to see, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier with the business and my teams, it's just transparency. And I think just being open with one another about your objectives, how you make this work for you. So, if I'm going to partner with a law firm, I don't want them to feel like we're going to squeeze them on fees to an extent where they're not going to actually make any profit out of what they're doing. I don't want that to then have a cascading effect on the quality. So I think, and whenever I've been sort of doing my kind of panels, not in a sort of strict sense, is those are the questions I'm asking. I really try and tell them about the culture of my company, tell them the cultural pressures that are exerted onto me and my team, and therefore they have a better understanding of how those will flow down onto them as a service provider.
It's quite interesting in these negotiations, sometimes it can feel a little bit like a win-lose, right? So you're charging us too much money. And the reason for that is, I think, partly a data problem, which is that unless it's really clear what the ROI of that service is, in which case some surplus is going to go to the law firm, some's going to go to the in-house team, but often there's a kind of, and as you put it, a transparency problem. And I think it kind of leads quite nicely, I think, into the kind of next section, where we want to talk a little bit about data and we want to talk a little bit about financial management. So just on the data point, I think we'll go back to Amy, because I know Amy's had some experience in this area. I think we hear a lot about kind of data becoming a trend in legal services and legal operations. Lawyers need to become more data driven. I guess the kind of fundamental question here is kind of, what does that actually mean? And kind of on a specific level, when we talk about numbers, what really should we be prioritizing, and specifically, what one number would you be looking at?
Yeah, I think the idea of data and data analytics can be really daunting, because I think of the idea of bringing data science into it and AI and artificial intelligence. And that's a really big leap to go from not having anything to having intelligent systems. So we can start really basic. And that would be, from my recommendation, would be making sure that you have a list of all your matters, that you are categorizing those matters based on a tier, for lack of a better word, a tiering model where you're tracking what are the bet the company matters, the ones that are the most important, most risky, most complex, and having a system that goes down to the more lower value types of matters. So if you have this a way to categorize these matters and then be able to attribute spend to them, I think that creates a really good foundation and will provide a lot of insights going forward, because now you can think about a lot of different things. How much should medium category matters cost? How long should they last? What types of firms should we use? Because we don't need super complex work to be done, but it needs to be, adequate. It helps inform how much you should care about these, how much you should outsource. And the premium, the bet the company matters, make sure you're working with the right law firms. Those are going to cost more. And it helps also identify resource needs. So where are we very volume heavy? Where do we need some more headcount, or where do we need to outsource more? Where do we need to find models that, like, LPO type of models who can take on the high volume, low value work? It informs so many different potential behaviors or future ways of working. And it's a pretty simple ask if you can prepare the spend or the financial component to your matters. And that would be working with finance or accounting to be able to do that.
And Natalie, I know you're the owner of a sort of mega spreadsheet, but what would you focus on? And picking up on kind of Amy's point around, well, this doesn't have to be data science level stuff. This can just be Microsoft Excel or Google Sheet. What are you really focused on there, and how do you kind of operationalize them?
I think in sales-focused organisation, you're always talking about number of deals closed and that sort of thing. So I think sometimes, looking at what your business metrics are and aligning your metrics to that can be quite powerful to allow to speak a similar language. So, I would say, yes, there's so many different metrics you can really easily implement on a spreadsheet. You just have to write in the information. That's the biggest discipline. It's just getting disciplined enough to fill it in. But I think the number of requests you deal with is quite a good number, because it's not that difficult to tally. If you've got a whip list of everything on your list, you can just do a very quick Sigma on the Excel, and it tells you how many. So, there are some really simple things that can let you know, or how much volume are you getting through. But I think, as Amy was mentioning, you can be quite clever with it if you're tiering it, if you're doing it by business function. I actually categorize the queries into things like NDAs, a query, an amendment agreement, an agreement, and a project. And that allows me to kind of, only with 5 different tags, to get a really good spreadsheet snapshot as to what's going on. Then also by business area. So I think the beauty of Excel is that you can filter things and do all sorts of things, which doesn't take too long to learn how to do. And if you're not somebody who feels comfortable with that, I'm sure there's somebody in your team you can become the champion for that, and actually driving that data analytics point.
And do you think, is that information that you then will kind of report upwards? So information on what you described as essentially what is the value that is being provided by the legal team. Is that something you would kind of report in the business formally, or is it more kind of internal thing for you to make decisions on?
I've used it in both ways, actually, in different roles that I've had. So, for example, when I've been trying to get additional headcount, I was able to work out the mean amount of time that a contract specialist in my team should be spending on matters during any one month. And by seeing what was in the pipe and not getting dealt with, allowed me to essentially tally that up to a headcount or half a headcount and give that business case. And so when I took that to the finance director, it was really easy to kind of say, well, look, this is what we're dealing with. That's the delta. equals, and he got it straight away. So that was
it's speaking the language of finance, really, there, isn't it? As opposed to saying, hey, we're stretched.
It is, but then a softer way of looking at it is even from how you manage your team and how your team feels. So, when it comes down to perception, so whether it was the sales team and the perception that legal were holding up a deal, I track whether something is with legal, whether it's with the business or whether it's with the other side. So we can see at any one time what's really outstanding and expected from us and really what's being sat on. And I found that in my current role has been really interesting, and our COO for our UK business does actively look at that spreadsheet every month to chase people in his team to go, what are you guys doing or what are you not doing? Come on, provide this information back to legal. So it's been a good pivotal point to kind of share info, and as I said, that transparency, but also giving you those measurements too.
And Holly, I mean, to bring it back to the question, if you could only monitor one number, what would it be, and what would your spreadsheet look like?
It sounds simple, but I just struggle slightly with this one. I think spend is probably the one I'd go for, on the basis that, and sort of Amy's alluded to it too, that it's a really good indication of what you're spending time on, also how your team is coping, what are the priorities of the business and otherwise. Also, again, as we've all agreed, it does give you an opportunity to speak to other members of your company, for us in Trainline, in the same language that they're often using, which is financial, certainly in figures. But I think alongside that, and part coming out of just tracking spend is time. I think the money is important, but if you're changing resources or the ways that you're doing things, then it's important to indicate what time is perhaps going to be saved by the way that you're doing things. Because time is something that is precious to all of us. And obviously if you're trying to implement new systems and processes, the way that it can be done legitimately and sustainably is by indicating to people how you're going to save them that one precious resource. And I think it goes part in matter management. So for us at Jira, so you can see what people are working on when and how processes can save it. But also it ties up to money, because if you're spending a lot with external counsel, then it often means that your team either don't have the skills, but more importantly, don't have the time to be doing it themselves.
Great, thanks, Holly. So we're going to dive into some questions for the audience. So thank you for sending those in. You can continue to send them in through the chat. Just before we do that, some of the topics we've discussed have been built into an ebook, which Natalie has contributed to. You can find that at info.juro.com/ebook. But to dive into the questions, so the first question we've got, I'm the first lawyer and only lawyer in my org, so this is a small legal team. Where should I focus my efforts first in terms of legal ops? Natalie, you're the first lawyer in the business and only lawyer. What would you do?
Well, I mean, as I said before, I've done this a few times now. I do think that that matter management of getting your folders and your email set up, even if it's not a shared system, you don't need it to be, it's just organising yourself. Getting that corresponding reference number in your physical folders and starting to save all your WIP documents in there by matter, really important. And then your Excel spreadsheet. So the beauty of Excel is, other than the fact that it doesn't spell check very easily, is that you can quite easily add more data and different columns to it. So I would set up your matter management. I think Amy alluded to this as well. Track what's coming in, because then it allows you to keep on top of yourself. And then eventually, when you do hopefully get that sort of budget for a headcount or assistance, then, if you don't have a PA, I mean, I don't have a PA, I've got my paralegal, and to be honest, most of her time spent doing legal work, they can then assist helping keep you up to date and keep you in check. And I found that's quite a really good way of kind of managing yourself. But I guess you do have to have the discipline to track what you're doing. And it's kind of down to you as to how much time you invest in that tracking mechanism versus the physical doing of what's coming in. But I think, if you've got that luxury of just going in, it's a new role, it's a fresh role, set yourself up early on so that becomes the way that you behave, and then it should permeate into just being a new thing that's part of your new role.
Holly, the legal team's still relatively small at Trainline, but if it was just one person, what would you be doing?
I agree with Natalie almost entirely, on the basis that as soon as you can, tracking your time and your spend will be the most useful thing. And you'll thank yourself later down the line, because the sooner you do it, the better, but also because you will ultimately, if your business is growing, need further resources. And that's a clear indicator as to what you're working on and how you're working on it, that you can easily justify to others, or at least put a business case forward as to how you get that resource.
We've got a related question here. So what was the first thing you did when you took on the legal ops role? So a question to Well, I think to Amy, what was the first thing you did?
Well, I think my journey to legal ops was a little bit indirect. So the first thing I did was build relationships with the top law firms and understand what they were doing for us and what their pain points were when working with the company. And this was back at my previous roles. Then here at Spotify, it was, I think we had just launched an e-billing platform. And so it was, what's next? How do we move from just e-billing to a more sophisticated matter management way of working, I guess. So that would be my answer.
And how was it for you, Holly? I think you were the first legal ops person at Trainline.
Yeah, there's two of us. We were there sort of both began the function together. But the first thing we did was just ask questions. I think it's the first place you do start. Again, legal ops isn't. It's just a way of thinking about processes and systems and efficiencies. And for us, it was more about what do we actually need? What are the actual problems or opportunities for us to develop something in order to solve them? And time is spent with talking to a team, or certainly talking to other stakeholders in business to understand how legal specifically, and for me certainly compliance and risk as well, can progress and actually work better for all of us. So questions is a big one.
And how did you go about that discovery process? Was it kind of workshops or just going out and talking to people?
Yeah, a combination of things. Conversations is, I think you can't underestimate it. People can be incredibly less formal than they would in perhaps a formal survey or workshops or otherwise. The one-to-one really helps in getting an honest opinion. And also because we had obviously begun rolling out certain systems and processes anyway, where we could track the kinds of questions that were coming in from the business. So we had a good starting point in terms of the easier wins, which for us turned out to be just literally being more transparent and sharing information.
So we've got another question come in. So I think this will be a good one for Natalie. So what's the most impressive thing an external law firm has done this year to assist your organisation from a legal ops perspective?
What was that a law firm has done?
What's the most impressive thing an external law firm has done to help your legal ops?
Oh no, I feel bad because nothing really comes to mind. And I think that's probably partly my fault because I haven't really involved them in the ecosystem yet. I guess, I've been in my role for a year now. I think for me, it has been a lot about fact finding, understanding the company's culture, understanding how to get things done, how to not do things. So I think if we're looking at the way I kind of started to get my kind of pack of lawyers together as to who were going to support us, I think, a lot of them being proactive, I think is quite an interesting one. I think a lot of law firms, as Amy was touching upon, are quite reactional, and you normally have to take the initiative to get the beauty praise, understand what people are doing. I have to say, I will call out one of the firms, which is Baker McKenzie recently, who, out of just a conversation on something quite mundane, which was to do with some company secretarial work, they've since got me, in front of a number of their different partners in different firms, and put even just a simple thing like it was a contact sheet for all the different lawyers in the different areas, so that I just had it to hand. It was a really clever thing. I think just keeping in touch, as difficult as it can be, because it does take time for people to have those diary reminders or whatever it is that a lawyer needs in a law firm to think about you. I think the more they are staying relevant and picking up on things, I think that's a really good one. I guess another example of that is I've got a guy that I met at a conference, quite a few months ago, who, from another sort of conversation or seeing what FleetCor are doing, understood that we're starting to think about the electric vehicle charging market and that kind of space, because we are predicated on a network of fuel providers. And they actually sent me to a half-day kind of seminar. They've sent me the details of that, and that's something that's actually quite emerging. And for them to actually get that intel and proactively send me something that I wouldn't have known to ask for because I didn't know which law firms are in that space, I thought was really, really good.
And Amy, have you had examples of firms doing stuff that's kind of proactively helped the legal operations function?
Well, proactive is a little trickier. But one firm did proactively reach out regarding a diversity program. Our general counsel at Spotify is very interested in launching a diversity program with the law firms that we work with. And this particular firm has a relationship with the general counsel. I've worked with the firm before, and they are very keen to launch something with us, or help us rather define what that would be, so we make the most impact in the regions that we're working with law firms. So that one felt good. It felt like a partnership. This firm wasn't going to be getting much out of it from this proactive outreach. So it was more of a shared interest type of situation. Another situation quickly was more proactive on our part, but we were able to negotiate a very aggressive alternative fee arrangement with a law firm by providing some good outcome-based bonuses. And so we were able to show, we were able to shift the risk to the law firm, but make it worthwhile, because it was worthwhile for our company if these particular outcomes happened. And rather than delaying something or making something go on and on and on, it'd be worth our while to complete it sooner. And we would give a kicker to the law firm. And so that was a pretty intense negotiation, but the law firm was very open to it, and we ended up making a good deal for both parties.
Thanks, Amy. And I think we've just got time for one very quick question, which I think is a good one to end on. So what do you think 2019 will bring for legal operations? So I think we've got time for one sentence each. Holly, what's happening in 2019?
That's a tough one. I hope greater clarity and certainty on the basis that there's an awful lot of different providers of technology flying around. So it'd be great that we sort of collectively share ideas and start nailing down what legal ops is and how it can genuinely help people, and solidify that. So
we've got clarity and certainty happening in 2019. What do you think, Leslie?
I think better awareness and it becoming more normalised. I think perhaps this has been the year of legal operations being a thing, even though I think it's permeated into different roles and teams for a while. So I think I'm looking forward to it being more accepted, and actually for a lot of people and organisations seeing it as a real kind of quality thing to have within their organisations and start investing in it more.
So we've got awareness, acceptance, clarity and certainty. Amy, have you got any more adjectives to add?
I would say it should be a big legal tech year. I think there's a lot of new, easy to adopt types of tech that's out there and continuing to innovate. And there's a lot of companies that are on older, slower systems that require dev time, development time, engineering time, and that's just weighing everyone down. So I think it'll be a year for legal tech, personally.
I think from my perspective, I add my 2 cents. I think we've moved a little bit from the practice of law to the business of law. I think to pick up on Amy's point, seeing the experience of law, so actually usability in legal services, I think will become even more of a trend than it is now. So I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you to everyone who's dialed in for this webinar. As I mentioned, the webinar has been recorded. It will be posted to our YouTube channel, and you'll get a link to that. So please do share that with your team. If you'd like to download the ebook, Natalie and actually lots of other authors have written for that. That's info.juro.com/ebook. Please do follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And we will be at the Clock event in January in London. And we'll have a stand there, so do come and find us. Thank you finally to Holly, to Natalie and to Amy for being great panelists on this, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.